Hey, this is Ihab, and in this video I am going to talk about one-point tracking. So here's my video, and what I want to do is to find a point that I can track text or a footage on for whatever reason that you want to use it for. And in this example I find this to be a really good point to use because when I zoom in on it, it has two main features that which makes me decide that this is really good spot. First one is that there is an area where one point can roam in without really kind of losing track. This kind of circle in here, that would be very helpful, this ring area here. The other thing that I find to be very helpful for After Effects to see this area is the unique look of this overall circle and the negative space inside it. Before we do tracking, it's really important that we play the video and we get to see what kind of movement or shaking that are going to take place. In this example here, the point here is jumping up and down a lot, and it's also moving sideways just a tiny bit. So when it comes to tracking, there are three main aspects that we need to be aware of. So if I select the object or the layer, and go into the track motion, once you click on track motion, you go into the layer display, not the composition. So it's really important if you want to retrieve the effect or the tracking effect that you have, you want to make sure that you go to the layer display. So once we go into the track motion, automatically we would get these. In a former update or in like previous versions of After Effects, this used to be an X, and now it's really painful to locate, and that's kind of really annoying. I'm hoping that they would fix it back to the way it used to be. So I'm gonna zoom in and I'm gonna talk about the way I do these things or I handle these trackers, because it's really important to know a really ideal way for even moving them. So you can see I clicked on this area when I moved it, and when you zoom out, when you click on that spot, it turns into like a magnifier, and this is incredibly helpful because you get to kind of choose exactly where you are tracking that where you're placing that effect. Another thing to know is that once you like zoom in without selecting on the tracker, you just zoom in normally. But if you have one like click on it, the zooming is going to be oriented towards that point, and that's pretty convenient. Alright, so the way exactly I do it is that I would start with this box, the one in the middle, and you can see I can push outside. Let me do this on the green background so you get to see exactly what I'm doing. So I would push with the box, and I could just kind of make sure that this is here the space that I want, and then I can modify the other one. Now let's talk about these two boxes and the point. This here, the bigger one, is called the search box. The search box is where After Effects is expecting the tracked point to be located in, meaning that I need to make sure that this spot that I'm trying to track never ever leaves this search box, because that's what's going to be a key element in terms of making sure that we always get the tracking on point. The other thing here is that this one is called the feature region. The feature region is what's going to look for unique looks or textures in a way that it can locate it outside other ones. For instance, if I want to go and track a point in here, After Effects is going to keep sliding this point all over because the whole texture here is similar to each other. But if I track this point and I put the feature box on here, this has a really nice and unique visual feature that makes After Effects able to track these points. And finally, we have the attach point, and that is the very small tiny point, which we also can modify. Now the thing is, I can go into the search box and move it around, but it cannot really push the feature box. However, the feature box can have control over the whole thing, and you can also like select from here, but when I select on the feature box itself, it can actually affect the scaling and look of the search box. So, like I mentioned before, before I apply the tracker, I need to play the footage almost entirely, just to make sure that how the motion is going on here. So you can see here up and down and a little bit of sideways, so that's good. That means that after I go and locate the feature area, which is here, if you want, you can even like make it kind of exactly on it. The other thing I would do here is have this point, wait for the cursor to look like this, and then I would drag it all the way here, because this is exactly where the tracking is going to be placed. And finally, I would go and take this search box and make it go vertically, so it would handle jumping up and down, and a little bit wide, so it would go also sideways a little bit. And my goal is to make sure that whatever happens, this area does not leave the search box. Alright, so I'm gonna go and click on the play button. Just before I continue with this, I'm gonna go into the options, and I wanna excuse me, bring your attention to these options here. By default, the luminance is what drives After Effects to look for those pixels. In some cases, tracking the saturation or the RGB makes it even easier for After Effects. So here's a trick that I learned and I found to be like a really nice method of making the tracking work if we had issues with the luminance. We can try with the RGB, and if that didn't work, what I would do is I would render a completely separate version of this, render out completely with highly saturated colors, and then I would import that exported video, and then I would then apply the RGB, which would make a perfect tracking. And then I would get the tracking information, and then I would just apply it on whatever footage, and then it would work out just fine. Anyways, I'll stick to the luminance for now. And based on my former experience, this should do the job pretty well. So after we put everything in place, of course you want to make sure that you are on the very beginning of the timeline. You go and hit play. One thing to be careful about is that some people assume that they can increase the search box and make it like crazy wide and big, and there is no specific disadvantage to that in a way that it may make the tracking less problematic. Yes, however, increasing all of these, like any of these two boxes, would increase the processing time of the tracking. So that's the downside of increasing those boxes. Of course, for the feature box, it needs to be containing unique information. So expanding it would be a bad idea if this kind of setup here is ideal. However, for the search box, it would be a good idea to kind of possibly expand or whatsoever. So now let me play this, just kind of going through the timeline here. You can see all of these keys of the tracking. So with that said, I can zoom in, and sometimes like one point could snap out, and you can just drag that point and fix it. Let's say it's snapping here. You can go frame by frame and just kind of make sure that you can that it sort of works okay. And you can see frame by frame where things are, and you can go and sort of like say, you know what, I'm just gonna do this at this point because this here is where it's supposed to be tracked. So you can pretty much eyeball it. So in the same sense here, you can see I'm returning it exactly to that point, and that's gonna fix it. So to do it manually, you can either move the points, or you can just say like, oh, okay, so I'm just gonna drag this and you know, put it exactly where it's supposed to be tracking. Now the other thing is that sometimes, let's say you want the tracking to be applied in here, and you cannot use the tracking on this spot. So what I would do is you can go here and unfold the motion tracker, and then tracker 1, and then tracking points, and then you can select these specific keys, or if you want you can select all of them and say, you know what, I'm just gonna drag them all the way in here. Of course, it's really important that you use this feature box and the point, the attachment point, as your guidance for where this is supposed to be. Meaning that if you want to track them on this spot, wherever you are on the timeline, just look for the attach point and say like, oh, okay, they probably need to be here somewhere. Okay, so I'm gonna undo that, I'm gonna undo this, and now I'm gonna go into the composition, and I'm gonna just unfold this and say Control T for adding a text tracking, and I'm gonna make this slightly smaller. Okay, and I'm gonna I'm gonna place it here, or I can just pretty much place it anywhere I want, and then I can just modify that later. But the important thing is that you name the layers that you want to be tracked, and then I would go back into the layer display, and I'm gonna select the video. Here's the tracker. Now that I'm done with tracking and everything, I need to go and edit target, and then I'm gonna choose the text that I want to track, hit OK, and then finally a really important point is to click on apply. Without apply, it doesn't do anything. Now that I click apply, it gives me the X and Y, and then I hit OK, and now you can see the tracking to be working just fine. And of course you can go and say, you know what, let me start maybe orienting this text. Oh, the text. Alright. You can also like place it in 3D. So you can kind of make it in a way that would just go in Z depth, or like rotating this way or that way. So you have the freedom to change the rotation, for instance, and that's not going to affect the tracking. Okay, so that was the 1-point tracking.